Hi, Nancy.
Hi, Doug. It's good to see you.
It's nice to see you. Look, we have matching backgrounds.
You know, it's all about careful planning, and we're going to be talking today about planning using that gradual release of responsibility instructional framework. Doug, why don't you kick us off?
So we've been thinking about, learning about, writing about gradual release for a couple decades. But originally it wasn't our idea. It came from David Pearson and his colleagues. But when we took it up in 1998, it wasn't that popular. It wasn't the major way that people were thinking about lessons. And we've added our own little twists and turns into gradual release as we've continued to learn about it. In many places, the gradual release has three major phases: the I do, the we do, and the you do. And we really wanted to interrupt that. We added a fourth, a we do together, because we believe collaborative learning is really, really important.
Just because we talk about four phases, it doesn't mean that it has to be in a linear approach. I think that's one of the common misconceptions that you have to always begin a lesson with that focused instruction, I do it, followed immediately by some guided instruction, we do it, followed immediately by some collaborative learning, we do it together. And then finally, in that independent phase, that's always the end of the lesson. In truth, these are instructional moves that people move around in multiple times over the course of the lesson and in lots of different patterns and trajectories.
I like to think of it as more cyclical or recursive in nature, not linear. I think one of the mistakes people make is they say, I get one of these, one of these, one of these, and one of these in a lesson. You could have 4 different opportunities for students to collaborate in a lesson. You can guide their thinking multiple times. You can have them try it on by themselves multiple times. We're cycling through these moves, these very intentional moves, attempting to get students to have more responsibility for their learning. So to not reinforce this top-down, let's start with collaborative learning. When I think of collaborative learning, I think of student-to-student interaction. Students using language to make sense, to negotiate, to talk, to problem solve. And they're working through ideas. They need to be tasks that are complex enough to require multiple students. If it could be divided and conquered, why would we have students do it collaboratively? We could just have them do it independently. So these collaborative tasks need to be fairly complex, fairly challenging, and students need to have enough language support to know how to talk to each other. What else would you think about when you think collaborative learning and the design of that phase?
That task design, as you noted, is something that is so important in that phase. You know, I know that as a beginning teacher at one time in my career, I thought wrongly that you didn't have students collaborate with one another until, as a teacher, I was really sure that they could do it. And what I noticed almost immediately was that students did kind of this divide and conquer. You do this part, you do this part, and we'll come back together in the last few minutes and assemble the work. It needs to have that intellectual interdependence. In other words, the task needs to be designed such that one person alone couldn't do all the work. They need to be able to interact. They need to come to consensus to be able to build out whatever that task is going to be.
And it is important that the teachers at some point share their thinking, but it doesn't have to come at the outset. So let's move up to what we call focused instruction. During focused instruction, we model and demonstrate. We share our thinking. We essentially provide a cognitive apprenticeship. So we open up our brains and we talk about how we're thinking, how we're problem solving, how we're figuring things out. In addition, in that focused instruction, we set the purpose for learning. What are we learning today? Why are we learning this? And how will I know that we learned it? Now that can occur anywhere in the lesson. We could certainly have students do some collaborative learning where they're grappling with some ideas and discovering before they hear the teacher thinking. In fact, the teacher thinking could be in response to the patterns of error that are occurring during collaborative or independent learning. But at some point in every lesson, teachers open up their brains and they share their thinking, because thinking is invisible. When you think about modeling and demonstrating, what are the non-negotiable things you look for in that think aloud, think along, modeling, demonstrating phase?
In particular, I want to make sure that if I am thinking aloud, for example, about a particular strategy that I'm going to be using, that I make it very clear to students what that strategy is that I'm going to be using. I don't want this to be just a stream of consciousness kind of experience for students. I want them to know, here's what I'm going to be modeling about right now. I also want to be able to reflect on and announce to students when it is that that particular strategy or approach or problem-solving technique is going to be useful. I want to be able to make sure that I tell students not only how it is that I'm using it, but why it is that I'm using it. For me, those are two non-negotiables. Announce it and make sure that they know why you're using it and why and what are those places in which it is going to be best used.
I also like I statements. I think in modeling and demonstrating, it's useful to say, I'm predicting, I'm problem solving, I noticed, I have a question. And then to go engage in that process you're talking about, like make your thinking clear. But it's your thinking. It's just an example of the ways in which problems can get solved, things can be written, text can be understood. And as we said earlier, then students eventually need to collaborate with each other. And then we think through guided instruction. As students have mistakes and errors and misconceptions, or they're engaged in some new learning, how do we guide their thinking? How do we guide their processing without telling them the answers?
Because telling them the answers is, in fact, not any kind of movement forward cognitively or metacognitively. Those scaffolds that are utilized during guided instruction are essential. Some of those scaffolds may be prompts. For instance, you ask a student a question and the student gives you perhaps a partially correct answer or even exposes a misconception. And rather than sweeping in and saying, oh, no, here's the right answer, instead to prompt that thinking of that student by asking, for example, what kind of background information would you be using right now? A little reminder for them about that. Remember that we have been working on X, and then that in many cases can help to spur what it is that that student is thinking about. Another technique to be able to use is to engage in some of that reflective thinking. For example, asking them a follow-up question when they give you that response, such as, does that make sense in this context? Again, you're not giving them the answer, you're causing them to be able to think. So those are a couple of examples of some prompts.
And I think as we process this guided instruction, the whole idea is to do that. Prompt them, cue them, question them, and try not to tell them the answer. That we're guiding their thinking, we're guiding their problem solving without telling the answer, without giving it away. There are times where we're more direct in our instruction, and that occurs in what we call focused instruction. But as we release responsibility to our learners, we engage in these guiding procedures. Now, sometimes it can be whole class, sometimes it can be small group, sometimes it can be one-on-one. It's not the size of the group that predicts whether we're guiding thinking or not. It's the teacher moves. The risk in doing this whole class, so you call on a student, the student's answer is incorrect, and you head down this prompting and cueing path, and the risk is it becomes individual helping. It becomes this one-on-one prompting, cueing, and the rest of the students probably start to misbehave because they don't need that. So we have to be careful about heading down a path to one-on-one individual helping. We need to think about what would the other students be doing if I'm prompting and cueing a single student in front of the whole class. Sometimes we just take note and we say, there's a misconception, there's an error. I'm going to address that one-on-one or small group as part of my next round of guided instruction. So we're always cycling back through these ideas. Eventually, we want students to practice and apply what we call independent learning, where students are asked to take on the things they've learned and produce something. Apply it, practice it, get better at it. Practice does not make perfect, practice makes permanent. And as we've been talking more about practice, this independent learning phase, we didn't call it independent work. We called it independent learning because we want students to learn from the tasks that they do on their own. So as you think about independent learning, what's on your mind around the ways in which we get students to practice and apply that which they're learning?
One of the aspects I think that is essential in that independent learning is for students to know about how independent learning supports their own learning. In other words, sometimes students come away with an idea that it is simply a compliance sort of issue. And quite frankly, that's on us. If we don't explain why it is that this particular practice time is so essential to your learning. So we need to teach them about principles of practice. For example, the usefulness of spaced practice and deliberate practice, that this helps to fuel their own learning, that it helps to consolidate and solidify that new learning that they're engaging in. Not just compliance, not just because the teacher said you got to do this and it's going to be worth 10 points, but rather you're practicing this because you know that this contributes to your overall learning.
I really like that you brought up that deliberate practice. As I've been reading some of Anders Ericsson's work, I love this idea that deliberate practice requires a mental model of expertise. And I think by and large, that mental model of expertise comes when teachers engage in focused instruction, when they provide that input time for students. And students get a sense of, that's what it looks like, sounds like, and feels like. And I want to get there. And then in that deliberate practice, students are more likely to receive the feedback if they have a mental model of expertise. And they'll strive and struggle. They'll set goals. And there's a really interesting thing that starts to happen, that practice doesn't just become compliance. Practice becomes that which we do because we want to attain that mental model of expertise. And I think that's the under-discussed part of practice. It's not just this rote, boring kinds of things. It's really about getting students to understand that that practice helps things automate. We become automaticity. We develop habits that we own because we've practiced it sufficient amounts of time. So taken together, there are 4 major moves that teachers can utilize. We talk about collaborative learning. We talk about guiding thinking. We talk about focused instruction, and we talk about independent learning. All 4 of those, multiple times. So I was thinking about a lesson. Now this is physical school. I was thinking about a lesson. I walked in and there were lenses of different kinds and shapes on the tables as the students entered the class. And their job was to look at this item, play with it, move it around, and write about it. No other instruction. It was just, here's this item on your desk, figure out, talk about it, write about it. And so they were playing with it. Some were holding it up, some were moving it around, some were trying to weigh it. They were all doing different stuff with it, and they were writing with it. They were then invited to talk to a partner. What did you say about this thing? What did I say about this thing? How does it work? What does it do? What's it for? And then the teacher talked about, through modeling, some light refraction, how light gets bent and refracted, and how colors work, and all this cool stuff. All of a sudden, you start to see all these light bulbs go off. And then students are getting out light sources and shining them through and holding it up. And some students said, can I go outside and try it? And they're starting to go. And then they had to write some more. And then they had to talk some more. And there were a couple errors in the group, and the teacher met with some small groups. As I thought about this lesson, this teacher is moving through these cycles of gradual release of responsibility. Of course, there are many other ways that this lesson could have unfolded. There's not one right way to gradually release responsibility to learners. There are many right ways, and there are probably some wrong ways. Do you have an example of a class that goes in a different order, that as the teacher approached the learning, that the students were given tasks that flowed in a different way. And I should say this, the whole decision-making process is based on what we want students to learn and what success will look like. The whole gradual release of responsibility rests on this idea that we are clear on the learning intentions and the success criteria. Without those, it becomes a random collection of tasks for students.
An example that I can offer is when students came into the classroom, and again, this is a physical school example, students came into the classroom and the very first direction that they had was to explain to the other people at the table what it was that they had learned the previous week. During that time, and it only took a couple of minutes for those small groups to have those conversations. During that time, the teacher walked around to the different groups and just listened in to the conversation that was going on and made some notes to herself about what it was that she was hearing. At that point, she then went into some modeling of what it was that she had heard and was going to then continue to build on, especially kind of fixing up some of those misconceptions or partial understandings that they had been exhibiting. At that point, she then moved them in to some independent learning. And at that point, students then wrote brief summaries of the topic that they had been discussing. And then finally, toward the end of the lesson, she moved into some more guided instruction that was going on. Students had self-assessed with their independent writing that they had done on what level of confidence they were about that information. And then she met with small groups of students who said, yeah, I'm not so confident about this. I've still got those wonderings. And she met with them to be able to do a little bit more of that direct reteaching that was going on. Very different ordering that was going on, but accomplishing some great things. I think what holds all of these together, whether you talk about your example or my example, is especially in paying attention as a teacher to what it is that kids need at that moment, that noticing, and then pivoting toward that next instructional move that's needed. And that, I think, is where the gradual release of responsibility holds its most power of all. It comes in that noticing and knowing what it is to do next with students.
And as you were talking, I heard lots of assessment opportunities. We don't wait to assess students until the end of the week or the end of the unit. We're always collecting that information from each move we make. We can collect information during collaborative learning, as you were just saying. We could collect data from the guided phase, from the modeling we provide, from the independent tasks we plan. We're always collecting data to see what was the impact of this move and how can I adjust it to increase the likelihood that our students are really learning. Thanks for talking to me about gradual release of responsibility.
It was great to talk with you about this too.
If you're viewing our video today, we're hoping it's really helpful as you think about planning intentional instruction for students. As a reminder, every student deserves a great teacher, not by chance, but by design. Design those learning experiences so that your students can develop competence and confidence.